Aleister Crowley. Aleister Crowley was an occultist whose actions were seen as controversial to the people of Britain. As a child, he would defy Christian morals, such as smoking and having sex with prostitutes. This garnered him the nickname the Beast by his own mother, a name which he reveled. He attended Cambridge University for philosophy and considered a career in diplomatic relations. He joined his first cult in 1898, but left after they did not agree with his way of life. He spent the next few years traveling the world. In 1902, he married his first wife, Rose Kelly. 2 years later, the two began to meditate. Through his own meditation, he heard the voice of Egyptian god Horus. These words became the basis for his new religion, Thelema. In 1907, he would found an occult order which he named AA. Meanwhile, his relationship with his wife was not going well, and the two would divorce in 1909. He spent the rest of his life traveling the world, promoting his religion and having sex with prostitutes. In 1923, during a ritual, a man died after allegedly drinking the blood of a cat, and Crowley was banned from Italy by their government. He would die in 1947 due to complications with bronchitis. Adler Antonio de Carli. De Carli was a priest from Brazil who attempted a cluster ballooning flight similar to Larry Walters in order to raise money to fund a spiritual rest area for truck drivers. He took flight on April 20, 2008 in a chair attached to 1,000 balloons, reaching an altitude of over 19,000 feet before losing contact with the authorities. A little over 2 months later, part of a body was found in the Atlantic Ocean by an oil rig. After a DNA test, it was confirmed to be De Carli's. Jim Corbett. Jim Corbett is a naturalist and conservationist. He hunted several man-eating tigers and leopards in India. In 1954, Haley National Park in India was renamed to Jim Corbett National Park after him. Robert Egan. Robert Egan is the owner of Cubby's, a barbecue restaurant opened in 1982 in Hackensack, New Jersey. He also acts as a sort of unofficial liaison between the United States and North Korea. The place became a popular spot with Vietnamese diplomats, and they introduced him to some North Korean delegates. He first visited the country in 1994. He has arranged for diplomats to attend baseball games and hunting and fishing trips here in the U.S. In 2003, he catered for the North Korean soccer team in the FIFA Women's World Cup. Tai Niop. Tai Niop is a farmer from Vietnam known for his extreme insomnia. Niop claims to have not slept for nearly 50 years. This seems to have no effect on him, as he manages to carry over 200 pounds of pig feed with him 3 miles a day. Peter Kürten. Peter Kürten was a German serial killer who became known as the Vampire of Dusseldorf. I won't go into much detail of how he murdered his victims, as I believe it is too disturbing, but most of his victims were young females, who he would strangle to death for sexual pleasure. He claims his murders were justified for revenge on the abusive childhood he had endured. He was sentenced to death and was executed on July 2, 1931. His head is on display at Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum in Wisconsin. Louis Hardin. Louis Hardin, better known by his stage name Moondog, was a musician admired in jazz, classical, and rock circles. He is known for dressing as a Viking on Manhattan streets and banging a drum. In his early teens, he lost his sight when a dynamite cap he was playing with exploded. He would go on to perform and study music in school and released his first album, Moondog and Friends, in 1953. His music was mostly poems spoken over jazz rhythms and street noise. Around this time, began his Viking shtick out on the streets. In 1974, Hardin moved to Germany, where he would spend the remainder of his life. He died on September 8, 1998. Ed Gein. As a child, Ed Gein was shy and did not have any friends. His mother confined him and his brother, Henry, to their farm. When Gein was 38, he and his brother were out in the fields, burning marsh, when it got out of hand. The fire department was called, and Ed reported Henry as missing. That night, Henry was found face down in the marsh. After their mother's death, Gein renovated their farm home. He boarded up every room she had used and moved into a single bedroom. In 1957, a local hardware store owner had gone missing. Her son had said that Gein was in the store the night before, saying he would return for a bottle of antifreeze in the morning. Sure enough, the last sale at the store was for antifreeze. When police showed up at his residence to arrest him, they found Gein's home filled with human body parts, finding bowls and utensils made from skulls, and cloth and upholstery made from human skin. He was confined to spend the rest of his life in a mental hospital. Dean's story has influenced characters in pop culture such as Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs and Norman Bates from Psycho. George Sodini. George Sodini was an individual who felt rejected by women in life after failing to find a partner for so long. On August 4, 2009, he entered the Bridgeville LA Fitness Center in Collier Township, Pennsylvania, and opened fire on a women's aerobics class, killing 3 and injuring 9 before shooting himself. Today, Sodini has been a topic of discussion in the incel community. Shanti Devi. Shanti Devi was an individual who, as a child, claimed to recall living a previous life. She told her parents that her previous name was Lugdi and she had died in 1925, a year before she was born. She gave the name of her former husband, who a friend of the family wrote a letter to. To their surprise, he actually wrote back, confirming everything Shanti had said. He and their supposed child would meet up with Devi, who upon seeing them, broke out into tears. At the end of Mahatma Gandhi, Devi and her family would travel to the town where she claimed to have lived in her previous life. She was able to locate the house she lived in and recognize several family members from her past life. She died in 1987 at the age of 61. William Robinson. William Robinson was a magician who went by the name Chung Ling Soo. On March 23, 1918, while performing the famous bullet catch, he was fatally wounded. The trick in question involves a gun being fired at the magician point blank, which then is plucked out of thin air. The illusion is made with a trick gun and a sleight of hand. That night, Robinson failed to properly clean the trick gun, resulting in an accidental firing of an actual bullet. He fell to the ground, saying, "Oh my God, something's happened. Lower the curtain." He died the following day. Zecharia Sitchin. Zecharia Sitchin was an author who believed that extraterrestrial events played a significant role in ancient human history. In his book, The 12th Planet, he believes there is an undiscovered planet beyond Neptune called Nibiru. Sitchin believes Nibiru collided with a planet named Tiamat that used to be located between Mars and Jupiter. This collision formed the Earth, asteroid belts, and the comets. The planet Nibiru was home to an alien race known as the Anunnaki. They first thrived on Earth about 450,000 years ago. He believes that humans were genetically engineered with genes from Homo erectus. His ideas have been rejected by many, dismissing it as pseudoscience and pseudo-history. Hamida John Dewey. Hamida John Dewey was a Tunisian agriculture worker who later immigrated to France. In 1973, a woman named Elizabeth Bosquet filed a complaint claiming he had forced her into prostitution. The following year, he kidnapped Bosquet and beat her, drove her to the outskirts of town, and strangled her. A month later, he kidnapped another girl who escaped and reported him to the police. He was sentenced to death and was executed by guillotine on September 10, 1977. This was the last time to date anybody has been executed in Western Europe. Ilya Ivanov. Ilya Ivanov was a Soviet biologist who specialized in artificial insemination. He attempted to create a human ape by inseminating 3 female chimpanzees with human sperm, but failed to create a pregnancy. Ruben Anage. Ruben Anage is a Filipino carpenter who has been crucified every year on Good Friday since 1985. He started this tradition of crucifixion as a way of thanking God for surviving a construction accident. He has stopped since 2019, which is 33 years, exactly how old Jesus was when he died. He is hoping to find a replacement to keep the tradition going. Albert Johnson. Albert Johnson, known as the Mad Trapper, was a fugitive. In 1931, he built a small cabin on Rat River in Canada. Later that year, the police received complaints that he had been tampering with animal traps. They tried to talk with Johnson at his cabin, but he refused. He would eventually desert the cabin. Finally, on February 17, 1932, the police caught up with him, and after a firefight, Johnson was killed when he was shot in the pelvis. Joseph Konopka. Joseph Konopka, known online as Dr. Chaos, was a former system administrator who was arrested for storing cyanide in a storeroom in the Chicago subway. He was sentenced to 13 years for this, and an additional 7 for pleading guilty to arson, vandalism, and trespassing. Laila bint Zulkais. Laila bint Zulkais was one of the leading poets of the 5th century. On her way to Yemen to marry the prince, she was kidnapped by a Persian prince for rejecting his advances. While under captivity, she wrote her most famous poem, if only Albarak could see, as a plea to be rescued. She was eventually rescued by her people. Thomas Hogg. Thomas Hogg was an individual from the 17th century who was accused of inseminating some lady's pig after its piglets looked like him. He never confessed, and since there were no witnesses, he avoided the death penalty, but instead was convicted of lying and stealing. Vladimir Kozak. Vladimir Kozak is a conman from Moldova who used hypnosis to steal money from bank tellers. It is said he took more than $39,000. I can only find a few news articles about him, and they are from 2005. Victoriano Alvarez. Clipperton Island is a small island in the Pacific Ocean near the coast of Mexico. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, various countries tried to colonize it. In 1906, Mexico built a lighthouse there. Victoriano Alvarez was the lighthouse keeper, and by 1917 he was the last man on the island along with 12 women and children. He claimed himself the king of the island. He began a campaign of enslaving the women for whatever purposes he wanted. One mother and daughter who refused to obey him were raped and shot to death. This went on for 2 years, until one of the women killed him. Alvarez might have known full well what he was doing, but it's also possible that he was psychotic. George Spencer. Like Thomas Hogg, this individual was also accused of bestiality when a pig gave birth to a piglet that looked like him. This time there were 2 witnesses, meaning he could be sentenced. He was hanged on April 8, 1642. Stubbins Firth. Stubbins Firth was a doctor who studied yellow fever. He chose to bring himself into direct contact with bodily fluids of people who had been infected. He made incisions on his arms and smeared infected vomit into them, then proceeded to pour it onto his eyeballs. Finally, he fried the vomit and inhaled the fumes. When this had no effect on him, he drank the vomit. He also tried the same test with blood, saliva, and urine. After failing to contract it, he concluded it was non-contagious. It was later revealed that the samples he used were from patients who no longer contained the virus. It would later be discovered that the disease was transmitted by mosquitoes. Robert J. White. Robert J. White was a neurosurgeon. In 1970, he tested a head transplant on one monkey to the body of another. The test was successful. Because the cranial nerves in the brain were still intact, it could hear, smell, taste, eat, and follow objects with its eyes. However, immune rejection caused it to die 9 days later. In the 90s, White wanted to do the same experiment on human beings, testing on corpses at a mortuary.